Warren Hooley is a 36-year-old man from the Okanagan Territory in Penticton, British Columbia. Having mixed roots of Okanagan, English, and Ukrainian, and growing up in both Western and Indigenous worlds, Warren sees himself as a bridge, helping both sides move from polarity to deeper connection. For the past 10 years, Warren has passionately facilitated over 1,500 workshops on a range of topics, including compassionate communication, Indigenous allyship, and decolonization. Awesome. So hi, Warren. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're so excited that you're here with us, and we're so looking forward to our conversation as part of the festival. I was wondering if we could just get right into it. Maybe the first thing that I wanted to ask you is if you could talk a little bit about the tools that you use in your various processes. You do a lot of work that centers on Indigenous allyship and decolonization. And I would really love it if you could start right off the bat by talking a little bit about the definition of those words and how you incorporate them into your work.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm really grateful to be invited to be able to talk about this. I am really passionate about just navigating the spaces of like being in community, facilitating, using arts, and trying to find ways to take, say, a complex topic like decolonization, and how do we bring that into our communities in a way that feels digestible, feels accessible, feels inclusive. And this is something that I've really been navigating and exploring and talking about for probably about 10 years now. And yeah, I'd love to just share some of the things that I found along the way that have been working for me. Just acknowledging that the work of decolonization is extremely large and complex and varied. And these are some of the pieces that have kind of helped me along in my journey. And luckily I have the power of technology at my side to use some slides to kind of guide our way. So in the screen share here, we're using technology here. I'm using double screens. Can you believe it? Okay. Here we go. There we go. So exploring decolonization, really particularly from a lens of our values and the systems that are built from those values. So just again, like I'm sure my introduction may have been already touched upon, but I am half Okanagan Seal, and my dad is Ukrainian, mainly English, and a little bit of Irish. And so even throughout my life, I've walked in two very different worlds. Half my life living in a predominantly white suburb in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, and half my life on a reserve in Penticton, British Columbia, now known as British Columbia, but St. Penticton, or the Okanagan was what it was once and still called by us Sikh people. And so because I've grown up in two worlds and had to learn both cultures, both ways of life, I had to learn to survive and thrive in both. And without realizing it, I kind of had a lifetime of education of looking at and understanding, well, what is colonization? What is the Western world? What was it built upon? And what was it like? What is it like simultaneously in Indigenous communities? And obviously I can't speak for all Indigenous communities. Even my own Indigenous community in the Okanagan, I only know a fraction of, but I've taken a lot of time to just try to understand like what it was, the process of colonization, and how has it led us to where we are today, and what's a really tangible approach to shifting that and inviting people in our communities to do that process with each other. So this little slideshow I made, some of the goals I want to go over is to deepen our ability to create balanced and holistic personal lives, strengthening our capacity to build societal structures that maximize the possibility for everyone to thrive, and learning models, practices, communication strategies to move from polarity and divide to connection, understanding, and new strategies that encompass all human needs. think I have a couple more here. I also want to help us expand our ability to reflect on what values we're prioritizing in our personal lives and on a societal structural level, and also look within ourselves and explore where we can be more balanced. I've really come to see that the colonial Western world we live in is really out of balance. There's a lot of years where I looked at it as I had a lot of judgment towards that. And understandably, judgments can still be there, but I've started to realize that the values that the Western world really prioritizes, things like productivity or individualism, ownership, these kinds of values, they're not inherently bad or wrong. I think where a lot of the harm or the struggles are coming from is that we're overly prioritizing those values, and then that's showing up in our lives. And we're seeing a lot of negative impacts from really, really prioritizing on those things. And what I'm trying to invite and trying to get us to do on an individual and structural societal level is to look at what are the other values that are maybe being neglected, and how do we bring those in so that can restore a little bit more balance to our lives, to the structures we're in, and maybe find some of the strengths of the Western world and fuse them with the strengths of the indigenous ways. So those are some of the overall goals and kind of my overall outlook, at least my evolving outlook on what decolonization can look like. So what does it take to apply a decolonial lens? So one thing I think is important is to first understand and clearly try to name what is colonization. If we want to decolonize, well, what is colonization? And what kind of systems has it contributed to today? Acknowledging that this is very complex. There's so much to learn. There's so many actually really incredible books out there about learning about where Europe was at and some of the history of Europe, where they had already done processes of colonization. A popular one is England with the Irish people, but it's happened many times throughout history and all over the globe. So it's a very complex thing. So today, I'm really going to explore more from my own lens, which is looking at how colonization has shown up in North America. This is now known as North America. And because that's the lens that I've grown up in and what I understand the best. And that what I might show and what I've come to understand, I think conceptually can probably apply to other places in the world, but specifically may not. And so there's a lot of complexity there. So just acknowledging that. Yeah. So colonization, this is literally two definitions you can get from a dictionary. The action or process of settling among and establishing control over the indigenous people and resources of an area. And I think a lot of times when we think about colonization, we're actually thinking about assimilation as well. They kind of just get, what I find is they get kind of blended together. So from an anthropological, sociological point of view, this is the process whereby individuals or groups of differing ethnic heritage are shifted into the dominant culture of a society. The process of assimilating involves taking on the traits of the dominant culture to such a degree that the assimilating group becomes socially indistinguishable from other members of society. Although assimilation may be compelled through force or undertaken voluntarily, it is rare for a minority group to replace its previous culture's practices completely. Obviously, we can see this with the many over 600 diverse tribes and indigenous people here in, I might refer to it as Turtle Island, sometimes North American, but can be referred to as Turtle Island, comes from a traditional story I've heard before. Yes, so you can see that a lot of, even with the process of boarding schools and residential schools, where there was a really concerted effort by the Canadian government and the American government to kind of completely assimilate, extinguish kind of the indigenous ways and assimilate all the indigenous people into, I think even quote by John A. MacDonald, like the white man's ways or white man thinking. Even with that whole process, you can still see that the culture has remained, and in a lot of places very, very strong. Unfortunately, in other places, some languages have gone extinct, and I think even some nations and tribes have also been have completely died from things like smallpox and that things of that nature. I want to make a side note here, and like a lot of what I'm talking about, this topic can be really emotional. It can bring up a lot of emotions, and I actually want to specifically talk about that today. But I just want to kind of quickly acknowledge that it is intense. The idea of colonization, the idea of another people taking over another group, and everything that comes along with that is intense. And I think that's why I'm actually really passionate about how do we find ways to do it where we don't just end up bypassing it and ignoring it and building up belief systems that justify it or make it so we absolve ourselves of any kind of accountability. And how do we find approaches that can it feels tangible, it feels workable, that we can all do this together, and it can benefit everyone. That recognition that a lot of the impacts that happens in the colonial world that we're in really does affect everybody, and in a lot of ways that is not good for us, is not supportive, is not empowering. So just an acknowledgement there. So one thing that I think is important to understand when we're talking about colonization is to look at a common belief that justifies it. And I do think that because in a lot of processes of colonization that have happened across the world over, many, many years, there can be a lot of violence and taking things away from people. And so what I've noticed is that there tends to be a belief, historically, that on one hand will dehumanize the group that you're colonizing. So you kind of have to make it, if you label indigenous people as savages, for example, or uncivilized, things of this nature, it gives you some kind of moral sense or some kind of reasoning of why it's okay to then take away what they know and then implement what we know on top of it and teach them the better way, quote unquote. So he usually dehumanizes one side and then puts a sense of superiority on the other side. And what's really fascinating about this to me is that, all of us can do this in different ways. That same act of dehumanizing one group and putting ourselves to a sense of superiority, that can justify violence, that can justify discrimination, stereotyping, judgment, you name it, or punishment, maybe. We that all of us we kind of grow up in a culture, in a mentality where that's normalized. And so it takes, I think, a lot of humility and a lot of personal responsibility and a lot of care for ourselves to come to the recognition that this is, in my opinion, that belief or that consciousness is at the heart of what colonization is. And to recognize that we may all have been conditioned and pulled into doing the same thing on maybe really subtle forms to really extreme, right? Like I think back when I was in high school and, as a young man, being really lost without really any healthy male role models, I really got pulled into a friend group who were the cool kids. And so in a sense, we had the superior way of being, right? Back in my day, it was like listening to gangster hip hop like Dr. Dre, Chronic 2001. And we held this ideal. We wear super baggy clothes and listen to hardcore rap. And, anyone who didn't live up to that, we had a justification into ourselves that we could make fun of them and we could bully them and we could roast them in public. And there was this kind of sense of like there was that same consciousness of like, this is why I'm allowed to do this to you. And I really believed it. And that's the really hard part when I look back and I see that version of me, this 15 to 7-year-old, 17-year-old young man. And I was really convinced I had it all figured out. And it had took a lot of years to not just change that mentality and let go of it, but even more years to come to terms with that was okay, that I accept that that's what I did at that age, and that sometimes I can still fall into doing to this very day. I can still see myself getting caught in that hierarchical thinking and putting myself above other people, and that justifying why I may behave a certain way. So that's kind of the general sense of the energy behind colonization to me. And maybe with the last comment I'll say is that I often summarize the process of colonization is who you are right now is not good enough or threatens our way of life. So we're going to make you like us instead and do our best to get rid of everything you once were before. And I know that's like a super intense statement, but I do think it's important for us to really take a candid look at like what is at the heart of this and understand it so that we can transform it.
Thank you, Warren. And, thank you for outlining the many ways in which these beliefs have like insidiously woven themselves into our social structure and the way that we like organize our lives right now. And at the same time, thank you as well for acknowledging how difficult these conversations are to have and like how much emotions arise when we're talking about these things because everybody kind of has a different reaction based on their life experiences, where they come from, who they are. So that also
Mm,
makes me really curious for you to talk a little bit about these social and emotional lenses that you use to channel in your work and maybe the ways that they help us to see each other or understand each other and
mm.
reframe our ways of thinking a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that question. This is something that I've looked at a lot. There was many years where when I was more formally developing this body of work in more of an indigenous allyship lens, I was with my dear friend Paul Hanix, who's a Haisla woman, and we would notice in our workshops that this kind of something would come up in people, and a variety of reactions. What I come to realize are like coping mechanisms would kick in. We wanted to understand it better, and so we started to look at like how can we create a diagram to kind of understand this. Um, and this was kind of the diagram we started to develop. We originally and still commonly refer to this as the wall of shame. Sometimes I call it the wall of overwhelming emotion. I think it's maybe more accurate because it's not necessarily always shame at the primary source. But what's happening essentially is that when we're learning something, like let's say we're learning about residential schools, which is really, there's so much, there can be so much intensity. If you really go fully into the necessary truth of the full, descriptive truth of what happened in residential schools, I mean, it's nearly impossible to not have strong emotions arise inside of us. And so when an emotion rises up and it gets past our sometimes unconscious, like we're not aware of it, but we have a threshold, what will usually happen is some kind of coping mechanism needs to kick in. And so there's kind of two parts to this. One side is that what's tricky is in the colonial world we live in the more Western world, the things like vulnerability, honoring our body and our heart and our spirit, um, normalizing counseling and therapy and ceremonies where emotional release was normalized and spiritual ways were used to process. All of these things aren't really in the Western world. And in fact, you could even say the opposite, that we could be made fun of. We can be um, harmed in some way for expressing vulnerability. And so it's this tricky crossroads of we want people to be able to come to terms with, say, Indigenous people going through residential schools, but culturally, they have not been taught the skills or have normalized the very necessary skill set to navigate it. And, things like being able to ask for help. I did not learn that growing up whatsoever. The idea of going to a counselor or therapist, no one had ever shown me the idea of a ceremony. Like, for example, going to a sweat lodge, which I didn't do until into my 20s. Even just seeing another man cry in a sweat lodge for the first time was just like, so it's this tricky tug of war, push pull dynamic that's so crucially important. And yet, I think we're still trying to figure out how to navigate it. So here's another diagram that kind of better describes the windows of welcome. Is actually a term coined by a woman named Sarah Peyton, Peyton, and it comes from the windows of tolerance, which I believe is Dan Siegel. I might be wrong on that, but it's this idea that every emotion we have a different level of tolerance to it. So let's say, for example, I grew up in a family where anger was expressed a lot, or maybe a community even as well, or a peer group as well. And it was kind of socially conditioned, and that anger was okay to express. And so I expressed it all the time. And so maybe my threshold for expressing anger and seeing someone else express anger is quite high. I can go to like a 9 out of 10, right? Before maybe I get overwhelmed and I have to revert to a coping mechanism. Whereas maybe grief was very, very different. Maybe no one cried around me. I grew up like, now it's very true for me. I didn't really see much crying. And I even, especially in high school, like I seen people get made fun of for showing sadness and vulnerability of that kind. And so it really, really taught me that's not safe. Do not go there. And so that was an act of, I would say, decolonization for me, or even just deconditioning for me, was to come to a place of building a healthy relationship to my own grief, my own sadness, my ability to cry. So it's just this acknowledgement that when we get overwhelmed by emotion, when we are navigating any sensitive topic, or we're going through the process of decolonization, it's very common for our coping mechanisms to get kicked in. And so here's kind of a list of some of the main ways that I think we commonly respond. And so the left list, which I consider usually to be disempowering, I don't want to necessarily say that's 100% true. But I would say this left list: persecution, victimizing, rescuing, bypassing means, it says bypassing. I would say it's usually not very effective at meeting our fundamental human needs. That's probably what I would say is important about that left side of the list. It's not to say that there isn't a place still for them. Like, there's times where like I go into my, what I would call persecutor, and I just want to vent, and I just want to get it all out of my system. And I think in the right container, consensual container, that can be great. It can be space, but the arts can be used so magnificently for that, right? I can pull up my loop station, create a song, and just like freestyle rap about something, or use art and just like get the raw emotion out of me. So I do think that is a really important place for that. I also think the bypassing category at the bottom, I'm noticing I made multiple typos on the bypassing, unfortunately. That's unfortunate. In the bypassing category, it essentially says things like ignoring, changing topic, um, using logic to not have to feel any of the things that we're talking about. Spiritual bypassing, which could be the idea of like using spiritual beliefs to skip over the emotional process. So just so you know, that's what bypassing is supposed to mean in this category. And I think there's a place for that. Sometimes we're in a scenario where we do need to bypass. We do need to, like, it's not safe. And we do need to use some kind of coping mechanism to settle our nervous system. I think that's 100% legitimate. And yet, if we only utilize bypassing all the time, then it's never going to fundamentally meet that core human needs that we have. And this is just, again, a lot of this is my experience talking, working with people, noticing these all in myself. And so what I've really tried to do is I tried to look at what are the alternatives. So if I'm in my persecutor and I'm feeling this fire, how do I have a sense of control of that fire and utilize that fire to take action, to set boundaries, to speak the truth? So, so important. And when can I notice, am I using that fire to actually burn other people, put other people down, judge people, get into this really strong right wrong mentality? The second category maybe is more like the water element. Um, and I think sometimes we can go into sympathizing. Let's say we're hearing about Indigenous people and their struggle, they're going through residential, and we can see them as victims. We can have pity for them or sorrow for their misfortune. Or sometimes the coping mechanism can be, well, like, well, I'm also a victim. So maybe instead of being able to empathize with what Indigenous people have been through and truly imagine what it felt like for them, what they were really needing, our own desire to be also seen for the ways that we've struggled come and they get even louder. And there's something to that also I think is a sign that we need empathy. We also need emotional support. We've been starved of it as well. And I think that's very true in the colonial Western world we live in, where we're starved of empathy. We're starved of emotional support. So my alternative is, how do we build a culture of more empathy? There can be a common response when we're feeling overwhelming emotion to rescue. And that's more of like unconsensual advice or no consent and just telling someone what they should do or just literally doing it for them, as opposed to being consensual, offering support, finding out what would work for them. And then the last one, bypassing, like I named the ones I said before, and alternatively, learning how to really feel the emotions, learning how to grieve, learning how to honor and be with what's in us in the moment and not think we need to be someone instead. So those are some common responses. Maybe I'll come back to this one diagram and wrap this part up. I really do think it's so, so important that we're able to access what sometimes I refer to as that river of grief, that in the process of decolonization, we can hear the truth, let's say of residential people going through residential schools, and we can actually empathize with it. We can feel the immense sadness. We can feel the anger. We can feel the emotions that are there, and we can connect to that deep grief collectively, individually and collectively. And I really think it's probably only then that we're going to be able to access the ocean of possibilities. And I think in small little ways we've done this in small subgroups around the world have been able to do this with each other and individual relationships. But I still think on a bigger scale we haven't. We're just really getting into that. And so I bring up all of this because I think it's really important to understand that when we're engaging with community and we're bringing people into the topics of really anything, it doesn't necessarily have to be decolonization, but it probably is related to it when we're teaching anything, that it kind of goes against the grain of what we've been told and what we've learned about the values and the beliefs of the Western European centric world. That things are going to come up for people. Coping mechanisms are going to kick in. So how do we navigate those waters together? How do we find a way to get to that ocean of possibilities? Help people get the emotional support they need, access the river of grief. Yeah. I don't know if I can hear you.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. But I was just thanking you for everything you've shared here, because these are such important tools and just something that we definitely always should keep in mind when we're working with different communities, is like the different emotions that might arise and how we can reframe them, understand them a little better, and understand what are coping mechanisms, what are defense mechanisms, so we can start to like tear those barriers down in a way.
Mhm.
And so I'm also curious to know how you include the arts in your pedagogy and how you use the arts maybe to connect to our stories or any other tools, whether they be practical tools or ephemeral tools, emotional tools that you would like to share with our audience. Because our audience
Mhm.
is involved in the arts, is people doing facilitation, artists working in community and independently. So I think we'd all be curious to know.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. Um, yeah, maybe just one final acknowledgement of it came up when you were reflecting back that I think an important thing for me it was like recognizing that and honoring all the coping mechanisms that I've had and I still have to this day, that they really did protect me and help me throughout my life. And especially when I'm younger, I really needed them. And so honoring them no matter what they were. And a lot of times our coping mechanisms can have side effects, undesirable side effects, and maybe even push us away from what we really want on a deeper level. But there's some irony in that sometimes we can become we as we become self-aware and we notice things, we can go into our persecution. The persecution can turn towards ourselves. Actually, in fact, all of these things on this list are both in and out, right? We can have them out towards other people, but we can also have them towards ourselves. And so how do we hold ourselves with that empathy, with the understanding, with the truth too, being able to recognize the truth in it. And so with all this said, how do we take this idea? How do we incorporate the process of decolonization into the arts, into our communities? Let's skip forward a little bit here. So this is a diagram that I found. Um, this is kind of a chart that I've been in the process of developing. And I've been calling it a values reflection chart. And the basic idea is that on one side of the chart, I'm trying to invite us to look at what values does this can just be values in general, but sometimes if it's maybe more of a decolonial focus, I look at like what are the values that the colonial Western European centric world, what do they value the most? What are they putting the most weight on? So for example, I use being productive as one of the most common. Like I think a lot of us can relate to it. Productivity is one of the most cherished values in all of the Western world to such a degree that I think we've become pretty wildly out of balance. We're putting so much weight on it. Like I can even invite you to think about your life. How much have you been taught that being productive is important? And how much have you maybe stretched yourself too far than what your body really wanted? Like, how many times have you burnt yourself out, gotten sick, even gotten injured, maybe even developed more severe things inside your body? Um, how much have we neglected relationships, lost precious time with people we care about? Oh man, the list can go on and on. The list is actually very extensive. I've had some really powerful conversations. This in and of itself, looking at one value in the Western world and acknowledging that it's unbalanced and looking at the side effects or the impacts that it has, just that conversation I think is really important. Because I'm not suggesting that productivity is an inherently bad thing. Of course it's not. Every single healthy society, individual on the planet needs to embody the value of productivity. It's a question of, are we overly prioritizing and has it become out of balance? And so the process I invite people to do is to look at what's another value that could help bring that productivity value into balance. And so one example could be building relationships, working inside an organization, being inside of a school. If we're looking at it from a structure standpoint, like a society structure, how can we make sure that we're spending time building healthy relationships? That it's not just about memorizing information in school and getting grades, but we're also learning about how to communicate, how to self-regulate our nervous system, right? Things that are going to help build relationships, play fun games with each other, have fun with each other. This can also be true inside of an organization. Another one that sometimes I put with productivity is self-care, learning how to really be in self-care. This is something I've had to really learn in my 30s and really recognize that I can't just keep pushing and pushing and pushing. It really just is not good for me on so many levels. And so really taking my self-care seriously, planning, booking in downtime, taking naps, taking baths. If I can afford it, get massages, do things like therapy, be in nature. There's so many things that as a human being we need. And especially in these COVID times, sitting in front of a computer in a chair, staring at a screen is not necessarily, and yeah, we're getting a lot done and that can feel good, right? That's still a good thing, but is it in balance? And there's a couple other ways that we can look at this. And, taking first, I think the process is, what are those values that the colonial Western world is really putting most of its emphasis on? So I find like productivity, the concept of ownership is really interesting, especially owning land, right? As opposed to maybe the sense of interconnectivity or shared land stewardship, right? Looking at both of those. Another category could be like, I thought of this recently, is just earlier and today was human-centric focus. That in the Western world, we tend to be really focused on humans and maybe not as much as the land and the other species that we live with. And so what does it look like to bring more of that balance, right? Cultivating our relationship with the land, deepening that connection, this, what I believe is this ability to, ability that we're born with. And that, even if you look from an evolutionary standpoint, for so many thousands of years, human beings had such a deep relationship to the earth. Like everything we see around in our life comes from the earth. And yet, as I grew up, the way that I grew up, I was very disconnected. I was inside all the time, for the most, the high up to high school part of my life. And I just felt uncomfortable being outside. And, I may be exaggerating a little bit, but for a lot of the time, that's how I felt. And that carried over into my adult life. And I really had to make a concerted effort to stretch outside that comfort zone and get and build a relationship with the earth. And the amount of profound benefit and mutual support that feel like my relationship, the more time I've invested in being on the land and literally feeling the connection to it, it holding me, has just been such an incredible, like it's almost hard to remember how I lived my life in true balance and health without that. And it's something that I'm still continuing to learn to do and continue to deepen. Um, and yet so much of us aren't being given that gift, and that mutual relationship of the land holds me, nourishes me, provides for me, and in turn I'm a steward and a protector of it, so that it can continue, not just for me but for the future generations. And so that's another example of like, what are the values that we've internalized in this Western European world, and what are the side effects, what are the impacts of that, and then what are the other values we can bring in, and what would more balance look like? I think that's like the ultimate question I've been asking. And so that's kind of a long description, but the new frontier that I think is really exciting is then, how do we use the arts to do this process? How do we utilize the arts? Obviously, maybe a more straightforward thing would be to literally create, like, I have a big canvas and have some of those values and some symbols and words that connect to how it's out of balance and the impacts. And then on the other side, the values we want to cultivate, the ones we want to bring in more, and maybe in the middle, some ideas and how it would look like. I think that would be a great exercise. In fact, I have a group that I'm going to do this with soon, so I'm really excited to try this out. But there's so much possibility. How do you do this with song, with sounds, with poetry, with maybe physical objects? I had this idea of like using weighted sandbags and like having a physical heavy representation of what we're putting our value in, and what do I consciously want to put my value into something else. um yeah, so I just like, I think that's really exciting, this idea of how do we bring this into the art form and utilize the arts to do this exploration process of the values that are out of balance and the values that can restore balance into our lives and to our, into the societal structures we live in.
Thank you, Lauren. That is so inspiring. I am also just picturing the myriad of ways that we can start to understand balance and lack of balance. And like I obviously very much agree with and reflect on all these different things that you've mentioned about like having internalized this very individualistic way of looking at the world, like very much we've strayed away from community in many senses. So that's why I think this type of activity and like the work that you do with community building is so important and so inspiring. So thank you so much. Thank you for everything you've shared. And to everyone tuning in at home, I hope you enjoyed this conversation, this little bit about Warren's amazing work. If you have any comments or questions, we have a forum open where you can continue to add questions as you're watching the video. So we'll be looking at those. And is there anything else that you'd like to say as we say goodbye to everybody?
No, just thank the two of you so much. It's been really helpful, you helping me kind of structure this and ask me questions, and it's just been really lovely. And it's an honor to be able to have a platform to be able to share things that I've learned, and call more people in to do this with each other, because I think it's going to take a lot of different diverse, personalities and minds and spirits and hearts that can really make this work for everyone.
Absolutely. Thank you again.